In this video, we'll be running through a calculator that me and Val put together, which gives you the maximum possible growth rate that your e-commerce business can grow over the course of this year. We've come off the back of January, which is a lot of planning for clients and putting together their expected growth rate on a month-on-month basis. But a lot of clients approach that conversation by coming in as, hey, we want to grow by 50%, 60%, 70%. But their business is operating on a net margin that doesn't allow for enough generation of working capital to be able to actually fuel that growth. And so the question kind of becomes, do you want to take dividends out of the business this year? Or do you just want to grow as fast as possible with the available cash flow that's coming out of the business? Or even a third option, do you want to go and get funding elsewhere to fuel even further growth, which is going to be necessary if you want to hit those high double-digit percentage growth figures over the course of 2025? And so thanks for joining me, Val, and I'm looking forward to this one, but I'll pass to you to screen share and start walking us through the actual math that underlies this so people can get an idea themselves of how fast they can grow.
Perfect. I'm going to share my screen now. Can you see it, Nate?
Got it.
Perfect. All right. So we've got the P&L inputs, and this is the typical setup of your P&L. Revenue, contribution margin 1, contribution margin 2, your marketing efficiency ratio, so your essentially return on ad spend, how many paid media agencies would call it, and your OPEX dollars, not percentage. And it's very important distinction that with revenue, your operating costs should pretty much stay the same, right, with revenue growth. Now, the reason why we have contribution margin 1 and contribution margin 2 split up is because contribution margin 1 is your revenue minus your product landed costs. So everything, all the costs you incur to basically make or create product and make it ready for sale. And those typically are your raw materials or costs that you pay to your manufacturer or supplier for the product. Then the freight that you pay to freight the goods into your country or internationally to make it basically ready for sale. And the import duties that you pay on those products. So all of it would be captured by contribution margin 1. Now, contribution margin 2 is customer delivery costs. So whatever it costs you to ship the product or order to your customers, and any payment processing fees or merchant fees that you have to incur to complete the transaction. Now, we split them up because when we consider the implications of inventory purchases on working capital, we simply need to look at contribution margin 1 because, again, you don't incur any costs that fall into contribution margin 2 on the customer delivery side and payment transaction or payment processing and transaction fees until you actually make a purchase. These are done ahead of time. That's why we need to consider them alone to see the cash commitment to inventory that you have to make to grow a certain percentage. And then also on the cash flow side, we need to consider the marketing spend and operating expenses. Now, once we've taken all of these into account, we can estimate our EBITDA to be $0 at $300,000 revenue. Now, if we increase the revenue to $350,000, then our EBITDA is $8.3 thousand. Now let's make it bigger, bring it up to $400,000. Now this is our EBITDA percentage, because again, all the variable costs will eat into the incremental increase in revenue, and OPEX stays the same. That's why we managed to squeeze a little bit more profit. Now, the reason why the profit is so little, even though we've just raised the number by 100,000, is because of marketing efficiency, right? Marketing is quite inefficient, right? It's a decent ROAS, but still, we'd like it to be slightly higher, and I'll show you the impact, right? Now we've just doubled the profit because we've raised it quite a little. So with 3.5 marketing efficiency, we could be looking at $35,000 profit per month, net profit per month at $400,000 revenue. Now, if we wanted to grow an additional 20%, which is the growth target right here, at this current EBITDA dollars and EBITDA percentage, we would need to see the type of inventory that we have on hand and what is our typical 30-day sell-through rate. So if we're selling through 35% of our inventory, then we likely need to invest more money in our inventory because we're not selling quick enough through our existing inventory to allow us to grow by another 20%. So we need to commit a little bit more money, a little bit more cash that we generate at the operating level of the business back into the business, which means that you can't take out too much cash out for your own dividends or, financing activities. And you have to take a chunk of that cash, put it back in your business, and specifically you need another $66,000 to reinvest back in the business to allow your business to grow by an extra 20%. Now, if the growth rate goes down by 5%, down to 15%, then the cash commitment decreases as well. So now you need $60,000. At 10%, it's even less than that. Now, whenever you optimize your business on the P&L side, and let's say you make it more efficient, and maybe you don't need as much inventory because your contribution margin one improves. So maybe you go back to your suppliers and you negotiate better cost structure. So now your contribution margin one is 75%. Now look at what happens to your cash flow. You see how the impact and the implications of you being more efficient on the creation side has on cash flow. You don't need as much cash because now your margins are bigger. Now, what happens when you start selling through more inventory that you have on hand? Let's say you go up to 50%. Now, again, you don't need as much cash flow to invest in inventory. So again, even if you have 70%, but you sell through most of your inventory at 75%, now we're getting closer to $0 commitment. Now, what Nathan also added is the maximum possible growth rate, which means that with your current setup, with your current numbers, what is the maximum possible growth rate that you can accomplish without committing any cash flow? And that would be 4.7%. So you basically have $0 cash flow commitment on top of your existing inventory the following time period. Let's say it's a monthly period, right? We're considering 1 month. If you wanted to have $0 cash flow commitment, then you could only grow 4.7%. And this is basically a conversation of adjusting your existing numbers. So being more efficient at selling through inventory, being more profitable on the contribution margin one side, or overall being more profitable at the operating level by cutting your OPEX or improving your marketing efficiency to have more cash flow at the operating level to reinvest back in the business, or adjusting your growth expectations, right? If you can't do anything on the P&L side, on the inventory efficiency side, then you have to adjust your growth expectations. You have to say, look, we can grow at 4.7% or at 10% right now. We can only allow ourselves to grow at 4.7% without breaking our cash flow, right? Then that's an adjusted expectation. You can make that work. Now, of course, we're talking about operating level of business, which means reinvesting all the profit that you generate back into your business. What if we could borrow money? Now, that's a different conversation. That's leverage. And leverage allows us to reach our growth target without any implications on the operating cash flow, right? We can then go to our creditors, let's say Wayflyer, Shopify Capital, whoever it is, revenue-based financing, term loan, line of credit, whichever instrument you want to consider. And then you borrow the same cash amount that you need to put back in the business and basically purchase the inventory that you require to grow at a certain percentage. So again, let's say we want to grow aggressively, we want to go at 50%. Of course, at this current setup, the business doesn't have it. And that's $54,000 a month that you need, essentially, if your sell-through remains at 75%. But let's make it a little bit more reasonable because 75 is quite aggressive. Let's say 50%. So you need $84,000 cash to grow at 50% month over month with your current sell-through rate. Now, if we wanted to repeat that growth rate for 2 months, we would need double this, right? So we would need $160,000. So we would go to Wayflyer and we would request $160,000 loan that would last for at least 2 months, maybe even more than that, 6 months, so that we can match the inventory that we purchase with the credit terms and make it reasonable for us. And that would allow us to grow without putting any of our operating cash flow in the business or in inventory, right? We just borrow money, take that, and extend our opportunity or our potential to grow. And this is what I typically recommend, because if your business fundamentals are strong, you're actually profitable, let's say at EBITDA level, which is quite decent, right? It's almost 10% EBITDA per month. We're profitable, which means that we can actually cover the cost of borrowing. So we can, price the repayments back into EBITDA, because again, EBITDA doesn't capture any repayments for loans. So let's say we have to pay 6% of our revenue to Wayflyer every month. That would be 6% multiplied by 400,000. So we would need to pay 24,000 a month in repayment, right? Which means that we would be left with $11,000 in profit, but we would be able to grow 50% month over month. So we're keeping $11,000 of our operating profit, and we can still grow at 50%. And as long as our fundamentals stay strong and we're efficient and we're generating profit, we can both pay back the loan and grow at a rate that we desire.
Awesome. I think an important caveat here that most, if we're talking to 7-figure brands here and maybe even early stage 8-figure brands, is the cash flow requirement that they're likely going to want to operate is going to be 0 or slightly positive. Because if that isn't the reality and they don't have a lot of capital just sitting in the business that's accrued over time, the bank account will be decreasing month on month. And that's, I think, a concept that particularly early stage 7-figure brands don't really realize when they say, hey, let's go and grow 100% this year, or let's go and grow 50% over the next 3 months. Your bank account will decrease because the cash flow currently being generated within a low margin business is not enough capital to fuel that growth rate. And it gets significantly worse as you start changing those P&L inputs. And so the reality is that, like, most businesses, unfortunately, I wish more businesses looked like this, but most have kind of worse margins, particularly if they're a retailer. Their margins might look like 60-40. And the second you start to make those changes, it just gets even worse. And you're suddenly seriously constrained in terms of growth rates. Continuing to go down the retailer example, retailers normally have a really wide product portfolio. And so their sell-through rates are generally worse as well, because they don't have 1 to 2 primary SKUs that they have a lot of control over. And so their sell-through rate drops. And then it's often the case that MER isn't in a great position, or operating expenses might be inflated a little bit. And then you start finding out, even just with the numbers that you've changed there, Val, maximum possible growth rate sits at 0%, even though this business is making money. They are actually printing $15,000 to $16,000 in net profit a month, but it's not enough profit to even cover cash flow requirements for growth. And so they can't grow.
Yeah. And that's primarily because of the inventory investments that have to be made. And those never appear on the P&L, right? You always have to invest in inventory ahead of time before you even sell it. And the P&L only captures when you have actually sold inventory. So all of those considerations for inventory commitments that you have to make on top of your existing inventory have to be captured. And this calculator kind of helps you accomplish that. Again, it's not perfect, right? In the real world, there's things that are going to be thrown into the mix, and it's never, it's never just pay now. Sometimes you can get credit terms, right? You don't have to pay cash up front, so that buys you some time. And that's actually important to consider as well, because this is assuming that you have to make a purchase right now and pay cash right now. If you have terms with your creditors, completely different story, right? You can go back to them and say, look, we'll pay you in 60 days. Perfect. And that's what a lot of CPG brands have to rely on, because they have extremely tight margins. They have to make a lot of cash commitments. Their sell-through rates are decent because they're in fast-moving consumer space, right? But it's still very tough for them to grow, and they have to rely on credit terms from their suppliers or on a lot of external capital to maintain that foundation. That's why a lot of CPG brands struggle to grow fast and dominate their niche, because it takes a lot of capital to dominate the CPG category.
Yeah. Something you mentioned earlier was in the previous example that we had up, and it's similar to this one, which is for these guys to grow by 5%, they need an 80,000 cash commitment per month to grow at that 5% rate. And you said that you can just go to a lender, choose an instrument that makes sense, and fuel that growth through leverage. Is that something that you would recommend this business doing right here, that's doing $400,000 a month at those contribution margin and MER levels?
Well, let's assume that there's going to be a 6% repayment every month, right? So here's what's going to happen to their EBITDA. It's going to turn negative because they have to take their operating EBITDA, which is $15,000, and they have to pay back the loan. So they have to pay back $24,000, which means that their working capital is going to shrink month over month because they're going to take all of their operating profit and just use it to cover their liabilities, which means that month over month, the commitment for inventory is going to increase again and again. So this is going to be an uphill battle from there, right? It's going to be all about managing credit terms and vendor terms to make sure that they don't have to pay cash up front and they save as much of it as possible. But yes, it's going to be an uphill battle. So adjusting the growth rate and the expectation to grow is extremely necessary for this business. And looking at the fundamentals of cutting the OPEX, right? Because OPEX is 1-to-1 essentially to your EBITDA. Whatever you cut here is going to go back into your EBITDA if possible, right? For example, if we look here, cut it by 20,000, that's 20,000 in EBITDA, right? And that's why so many CPG brands have to operate so lean, because margins do not allow for any profit generation early on until they hit volume. So they have to be extremely lean and they have to cut their OPEX as much as possible because that's cash in the business. And now they can actually afford to borrow money and grow at a rate that they need.
Perfect. Is there anything you'd wrap this video up with? The only statement that I would make is if you were growing at the target rate, so let's say we put in scenario, you grab this calculator, you put your own numbers in, and it says, hey, your max possible growth rate sits at 10%. Like, okay, fantastic. That means that we could technically grow at 10% per month moving forward, which might, once you do the forecast, compound across the year to 60% year-on-year growth, which hits your targets. And so you go, great, we have all of the metrics. We have essentially like the P&L design that's going to facilitate those numbers. However, there's a big caveat on that, which is that you will be able to take $0 in dividends because all of your cash flow will go towards working capital requirements to hit that maximum possible growth rate. And so the question does kind of become, what is your measure of success, or what is the objective of the business? Is the objective to simply maximize growth? Yes, net profit percentage might be there, but unfortunately in a business that relies on goods, net profit does not equal dividends yielded or drawn from the business by the directors. And so what is the objective? Do you want dividends being pulled over the next year? And are you willing to sacrifice a lower growth rate to do so? Or are you willing to take $0 in dividends out of the business, but just crank up growth as hard as you can for some kind of future liquidation event?
Yeah. And I mean, that's what happens in the private equity and the aggregator space, right? What they do is they take a brand and then they just take the capital that they've raised from investors and they crank it up and they start growing fast, breaking any sort of economics. That doesn't make sense to show those revenue numbers and show, oh, we're growing so rapidly, but then all of it kind of collapses the moment the growth stops or the moment the profit, the cash burn on the operating level starts, it flips ridiculously and they don't have enough capital to support that level of cash burn. I would say for brands to stay away from any type of growth, aggressive growth, unless you're targeting volume. So let's say there is actually an opportunity for you to optimize your margins once you've grown to a certain level. If that's the case, then you can actually break any economics in the short term, find capital, as long as it makes sense mathematically, right? Break economics in the short term so that you can reach that level of scale or volume that will buy you a lot of margin, because there's a way for you to basically negotiate better terms and get the past savings from your manufacturer to you by simply ordering more product. And if that's the case, then yes, you can break economics in the short term, focus on growth at any cost, essentially, until you hit that volume. And once you've hit that volume, you will get more profit. And that's when you can start optimizing and then paying yourself dividends as well. So I think it all depends on the context. It depends on the runway that you have. Because again, how much cash do you have on hand? If you've got a ton of cash that is just sitting there, maybe you can just grow rapidly, right? Month over month. Invest that in the business. You can borrow money as well to help you, reduce the internal risk and basically give you that leverage. So there's so many things, but something that I would maybe focus on is keeping your sell-through rate as high as possible. Because again, sell-through rate is basically how much inventory do you have left on hand that is not selling. And 90% means that 10% stays on hand, right? And if it goes down to 35%, which is the typical rate for a lot of apparel brands, for example, 35%, it's quite low, right? So you can imagine how much more of a cash commitment you have to make every month. And there's a lot of overstock building up. And so much overstock that sometimes there's thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars of overstock or dead stock that will never sell, that you have to get rid of as quickly as possible, because that's cash that you could reinvest back in the business that is just sitting there, right? So focusing on the sell-through rate is extremely important to make sure that you're untying all that capital and putting it back to work.
Perfect. I'll end this video with, if you want this calculator, I'll clarify, it is relatively rudimentary, but if you want to plug in your numbers, reach out to us on bluesense.digital.com.au. I'll put it in the description. To take this a step further, to really know your numbers and have all the nuances behind it, I'd strongly recommend reaching out to Val. And so I'll put his LinkedIn in the description below. And then lastly, subscribe. We'll do more videos soon. Thanks, Val.
Cheers.